So for a second consecutive week, Boston College gets some primetime national television exposure, taking on USC, a home game for BC, welcoming in the ninth-ranked Trojans. And we bring in Brian Favat of BC Interruption, BCI. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
Okay, it's been a while. Let's talk some USC football. Trojans hit with scholarship reductions, of course, in a bowl ban at one point. Seem to be rebounding quite well. Still have some depth issues, but if you're just looking at star power on defense, they seem to be loaded. The offense exploded against Fresno State, which may not be a huge deal since Fresno State got carved up by Utah the next week. And they somehow pull out a win against Stanford despite gaining only 291 total yards. So your thoughts about the Trojans at this point?
Yeah, I mean, BC's in for a big test this week, even with the scholarship reductions, missing Trey Madden at running back, and it looks like they'll be missing Hayes Pollard for the first half of the game due to ejection for targeting in the Stanford game. But despite all those losses, BC is definitely preparing for a very talented team and a very motivated team. So the USC shot up to number 10 and number 9 in the polls this week, and definitely looking to build on the momentum of a big win on the farm last weekend.
Definitely. When you've got the name brand of USC and you win a big game against Stanford that's proven to be an elite program here in the last 3 or 4 years, you don't have to play Oregon. They're suddenly thinking, wow, this thing's wide open for us to have a big season, possibly make the college football playoff. Let's turn our attention toward BC. You're coming off a 30-20 loss to Pitt. It would appear from the box score and from checking out the highlights that they dominated the line of scrimmage. Let's start with Tyler Murphy's performance. He comes in from Florida. We saw him play at quarterback there, and he also, I believe, played some wide receiver. 10 for 28, rushes for 100 yards, so he's got 2 consecutive 100-yard rushing games, or roughly there in that range under his belt. So your evaluation of Murphy's performance last week and in 2 games played thus far?
Sure. So it's been an interesting experiment with Murphy. Definitely a different quarterback than BC's used to. A dual threat running, primarily running target. Running quarterback. So it's been interesting to see how the offense has adapted to that. Through 2 games, it's been a mixed bag. So Murphy did well against UMass at UMass in the opener. As you mentioned, rushed for over 100 yards and had a decent day passing. Week 2 was mixed, so a lot of incomplete passes, which was a bit disappointing, and a lot of that was on Murphy, but I think a good portion of it was also on the receiver. So a lot of drop passes, a lot of missed opportunities in the passing game. He did run over for over 100 yards. A good bit of that was on a single play, so it was a busted. Or it was a misdirection, a zone read that went for about 51 yards, if I recall. That set up a BC touchdown, and a lot of that yardage, positive yardage too, was in garbage time. So, 30-10 loss on Friday night. To be honest, the final score was much closer than that game actually was. So BC kind of got pushed around a lot. In the defensive front, and James Conner had a big day. Tyler Boyd had a big day too. So a bit disappointing from that perspective of the BC defense not being able to slow down the Pittsburgh playmakers.
Brian, let's talk some more offense. I would think that most BC fans and most college football fans that are keeping an eye on the ACC and Boston College in particular would think that this program's headed in the right direction. But we talked about it in the offseason. Had the big breakout year from 2-10 to 7-5 with the bowl loss. But even though the program's probably on the ascension and Adazio's doing all the right things, that you might take a step back in 2014 because you lose 90% of the offense with an NFL running back, Andre Williams, leaving, Amidon gone, Chase Reddick gone. So talk about the rest of the offense, because we got familiar with those guys, and especially Williams tearing things up. Who are the guys that we're going to see in prime time against USC?
Sure. So I guess starting at running back, it's impossible to replace the production and really the breakout year that Andre Williams had on the way to winning the Doak Walker, becoming a Heisman finalist. But BC does have some talent in the backfield, starting with sophomores Miles Willis and Tyler Rouse. They're a bit of different backs, but they're good between the tackles, but also around the edge. They're sort of the go-to guys, kind of option one and option two out of the backfield. The program's really high on a true freshman too, John Hillman, who originally committed to Rutgers and then decommitted and committed to the Eagles. More of a kind of a power back between the tackles. Get 3 or 4 yards at a time. So he's looked good in limited touches, and I think the program's really high on the future of running back with those guys. As far as the receivers, it's interesting because last year Alex Amidon was basically targets 1 through 5 for Reddick. Amassed a ton of yards, but really no one else kind of stood out in the passing game. It'll be interesting this year. There's a bunch of big bodies, guys with some speed. Shaquem Phillips is back from UConn, so he originally was on the Heights and then transferred out to UConn and is back for a 5th year. He's a big target, had a touchdown against Pittsburgh and a pitching catch from Murphy. A bunch of other guys are looking for sort of breakout seasons. Josh Bordner, who was BC's backup quarterback. Now he's one of the primary targets in the receiving game, as well as I think the program's pretty high on Charlie Callanan, who's a big body wide receiver. So those 3 guys, I think another guy to keep an eye on is Sherm Alston. So he's a running back out of New Jersey, true freshman. So he was recruited at running back, but they're using him more kind of as a slot receiver and kind of a guy that you can get the ball in space and can make some moves. He's got a lot of speed, and you can definitely see the potential there. And then finally on the offensive line, so that was probably one of the strengths of BC going into the season. So they have a veteran offensive line. I think they have 3 starters back from last year's team that bulldozed their way to Andre Williams having a 2,000-yard rushing season. But we've already lost Harris Williams on the offensive line, and we did gain Ian Silverman, who's another Florida transfer, sort of similar to what we had last year in Matt Patchen, who came from Florida as a grad student and did his 5th year here.
All right, Brian, let's talk some defense. Sean Dugan has got a knee issue. What's his status for this game? And if you could just run down the defense, we see that Justin Simmons is off to a nice start as well, but you give up 300 rushing yards to Pitt. So your outlook on this BC defense?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I don't think Dugan's going to be ready to go. I think he's probably doubtful for this game. So Daniels will slot in there at middle linebacker. Linebacker is a strength, but as you mentioned, it was a mixed kind of bag with Pitt. Ton of missed tackles, and the defensive front 4 really got blown off the line by Pitt's offensive line. So that was a bit disappointing in the fact that the Pittsburgh offense is sort of a kind of a BC clone, if you will. Power running game, kind of control the clock, and then get the ball to playmakers in the receiving core. So I think the most disappointing aspect of last week was that BC had a week to prepare against a team that looks remarkably similar to them on offense, and they sort of got manhandled on the lines and had a ton of blown tackles. I think the 2 leading tacklers from the Pitt game were defensive backs. So obviously there's a problem when defensive backs are leading the team in tackles. So tons of missed tackles and really getting James Conner out in the only getting him down in the open field. That was a bit disappointing.
So BC with a return trip from USC after the Trojans won the game at the Coliseum last year, 30-7. Cody Kessler, 15 of 17 in that game. Brian, we appreciate the time. We see you got your Boston College colors on, so ready for prime time Saturday night with BC hosting USC. So an interesting matchup here, and a series that BC set up to probably achieve some other goals in recruiting and otherwise, and some national exposure there as well. So, Brian, we appreciate the time. Enjoy the game, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.